Well, greetings to everybody. I've got Ben Pyle on my channel today, and very grateful that he's given me his time because he's got a very big brain when it comes to this kind of environmental stuff and how it fits into the political dynamic. I first met him, I think it was about 14 or 15 years ago. And I said, I've been sort of checking up on the data and on the science, and a lot of what we're being told seems to me to be a load of bollocks. And he pointed out, and penny hadn't dropped with me 15 years ago, that it's about political ideology, not about science. And of course, that's becoming much, much more obvious now. Every year goes by, we realize that. More and more of us realize it. Not yet the BBC, sadly, or probably Sky TV, but I think the man on the Clapham omnibus is beginning to get it. We're going to have a crack at Ben's huge brain and see if he can help us out with understanding some of this phenomenon. So welcome, Ben. Welcome to the channel. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. Very kind of you. Very nice introduction. Very generous. Thank you.
Would you just develop it for people who it came as a something as a bombshell to me, to suddenly the scales, if you will, fell from my eyes when I realized this. But of course, as my world in the investment world and mortality statistics of life assurance, where I manage funds, was about actually the interpretation of data. And if you set about environmentalism on that basis, you go down a cul-de-sac, because it isn't about the interpretation of data. When I say interpretation of data, most people don't know how to interpret data anyway, because they're not trained. And I've been trained in a different field, not a scientist, but trained in the assimilation of data and so on and so forth. And when you look at things like, and I'm not wise after the end, this has been on my website now for some years, the absurdity of electric vehicles, the absurdity of wind turbines, all these things, where if you sit down and just interpret the data, you know they don't work, but still it goes on. Still we have more and more. So put us on the track. Why is this? What's happening? How did it all start, and where are we going with it?
Well, climate change, I think, started a fair bit later than environmentalism as such, as we sort of know it today. And it's in the late 1960s and early 1970s that the kind of environmental agenda that we're now experiencing really started to be established on the world stage. 1972, in fact, was the first United Nations Environment Programme meeting, and that was pretty much the same as it is today. A bunch of green billionaires having designs about how society should be organized, and those were, this is fairly well discussed now. People have gotten onto this, that there is this big history to environmentalism, very dependent on computer modeling, even back in the early 1970s, when these kind of ideas were just where computer science was just beginning. And they had an idea about how the world must be organized, and if the world isn't organized in this way, according to these computer models, then society and civilization would inevitably start to collapse. That's what their computer models seemingly told them. But it's half a century later that we're discovering that actually computer modeling is a very big fig leaf. Or maybe it's just a small fig leaf flapping in the wind, and actually behind that there's a great deal of shame. And somehow that whole early period of globalist environmentalism, if I can put it that way, has been forgotten. We've forgotten about between the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1990s, where all these predictions were made about the imminent. Paul Ehrlich famously, I think, claimed that there'd be no such country as England or Britain. I'm not sure which one he said, by the year 2000, and he predicted, of course, the demise of similarly India. India wouldn't be around as a country, and of course India's gone from strength to strength. It's got a long way to go, of course, but all of these predictions that were made by these green computer modelers in that decade just came to naught, and then they got rescued by the global warming idea. And actually the global warming idea really took root after the creation of the computer simulations that were made of the effects of nuclear war. So, this was the nuclear winter was the product of computer modeling, global circulation models, they were called. So they said, if there is this conflagration in this exchange between East and West, this nuclear exchange between East and West, then it will have this climate effect. And then these models started to be adapted towards the growing concern for global warming, because of course that had been immediately preceded by the idea that we were about to go into an ice age. But the global circulation model said, no, we're going to have this catastrophic warming. So all of this has been forgotten, and sort of one of the reasons it got forgotten was because the Cold War ended. And of course, those computer models, found new application in environmentalism. But nonetheless, there's kind of this very, very significant historical disjuncture. We felt post 1990 that we were probably, or politics just seemed to be in a different epoch. But I'm going off the track. So when global warming sort of moved up the political agenda through the 1990s, I think when it hit a lot of people just took it for granted, because it was the claims were being made by very respectable global scientific institutions, and we don't really think about how scientific institutions can be colonized by politics, and like how they can be swayed by ideological ideas. But I think they were, and so there was a lot of good faith that was sort of abused. In general, there's a cultural attachment, particularly in the pragmatic. We had a very pragmatic ideology in Britain. Not too much of this, not too much of that. We'll go with a mixed economy, and we'll let the left and right try it out in a democratic way, right? You see where I'm going. So people have a lot of faith in institutions, particularly in institutions of science, but these are also quite, they're quite political organizations, and they're bureaucracies in many senses. Organizations like the Royal Society, for example, very influential scientific academy, the oldest scientific academy in the world, in fact, founded by Isaac Newton, I believe, and others. So we like we sort of put a lot of good, we invest a lot of faith in these institutions, and so when they take liberties with facts, it's very difficult to confront them and to challenge them. So that's why I think it took us a long time. So what I argued, sort of more towards the 2010s, was that you don't need to unpick climate change science to understand that the premises are false. So in a sense, if we get too into the weeds on the science, we take for granted the environmentalists' claims, because it's always saying, yeah, well, if the science is right, then the politics is right. But and politics and ideology are these confusing terms, often interchangeable, but they shouldn't be. So politics is this battle between ideas in parliaments and so on, and in the public sphere, whereas ideology is this much more nebulous concept about how people see the world and the ideas. So well, of course, if it gets warmer, then there's going to be more poverty and there's going to be more war. And so that's an ideological claim, and it's the claim that environmentalists make, and those are the kind of claims that need to be unpacked and pored over, at least as much as we've been doing to the science. So the maxim that Greens offer is climate change is going to be worse for the poor. Okay, so they say for that reason, we need to make these radical changes to society. We need to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, and we probably need to have some kind of redistributive economic policy. Well, not some kind. It's a very aggressive redistributive economic policy they want to create, essentially wiping out quite a lot of wealth creation in the process. There's an immensely strong degrowth aspect to political environmentalism. So what I said was more important than looking at how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere and how much warming there has been is, well, let's just look directly at the impacts. Okay, what's the prevalence of malnutrition? What's the prevalence of communicable diseases? What do the signals tell us about GDP per capita growth and in purchasing parity terms, right? And things of that order. And it turns out, if you look at all of these impacts, much as Bjorn Lomborg has observed, actually, they're all getting better, and they're getting better without historical precedent across the world and at all levels of development. Rather than seeing climate change reflected in statistics relating to agricultural productivity, for example, you see even in the poorest parts of the world, agricultural productivity increasing on a per capita basis. Wealth is increasing, longevity is increasing, childhood mortality is just, there has no precedent in history. The last 30 years has seen this extraordinary decline in the rates of people, of children dying before their fifth birthday. So, you know, even in Germany, for example, in the late 19th century, infant mortality was as high as 50%. In the last decades of that century, and now it's of course fractions of 1%, and this is the way the whole world's going. So my argument is economic. If we have these aggressive climate change policies, these policies intended to reduce the abundance of energy and the affordability of energy, then that progress is very likely to be reversed. It's essentially, that is to say, climate policy is going to be worse for the poor than climate change itself, by quite a long chalk. What we should be really doing, if we owe anything to anyone, whether that's people on the other side of the planet who live in very poor places, or to future generations, or even to ourselves in this society, the best thing that we could do is make energy affordable and abundant, and then pretty much the weather, whether it gets worse or not, and we can come on to that in a moment, we are better protected from it. If you've got diggers, you can protect yourself from floods. If you've got transport infrastructure, you can run away from extreme weather, or you can relocate. I mean, I'm putting it in extreme terms. It doesn't even belong in these extreme terms. If you're wealthier, you build a better house to better standards, and you are better protected from the weather. And the same goes for oil industries as well. But it also turns out there aren't more storms. Those storms aren't becoming more frequent and intense, and other categories of extreme weather, so-called extreme weather, such as wildfires. There are not more wildfires. There are fewer wildfires than there were decades ago, and so on and so forth. So all of these stories about climate crisis, and it's climate crisis that motivates the political argument. It's not actually climate science. They're all bunk, all of them. And there's simply no truth to it. So to bring it back to the point I think you raised, we can waste our energies talking about climate science. We can talk about the physics of CO2 in the atmosphere, and how that plays out. Or we can just point out that this ideological idea of human society and much of nature being very closely dependent on temperature, and we can show that it's bunk with observational data right now. Right, we don't need computer models. We don't need to disassemble any computer models. It's just an ideological presupposition that we live in this very sensitive ecological niche.
Interesting. We're talking of computer modeling, which sort of, or in the world I come from, was actuarial modeling or investment modeling, for example. And if we had let's say we had a 10% increase in the stock market, just for example, which was not infrequent in the 80s and 90s, certainly the 90s. If I was doing a presentation on the fund I was running to a board of trustees, I was not allowed by the regulators to extrapolate that 10% over any period of time. Because what people were doing until they stopped it was saying it was up 10% last year. If we get 10% for the next 5 years, you'll double your money. And we just simply weren't allowed to do that. It was illegal to do that. And we've seen, especially in the COVID hoax, we've seen Imperial College London and Neil Ferguson and people like that using mathematical extrapolations of that nature, which are illegal in the field of finance. And of course, which is why Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College has been wrong almost consistently all his career, because he feeds rubbish into his computer. And of course, we all know he'll get rubbish out the other end. So we have this problem that nobody challenges a computer model. So it's sort of point one, isn't it? That you would say to people, they say, just a minute, when they show a model, and they're still doing it because it's still not illegal. They say, if this goes on, blah, blah, the data you get out of it is going to be wrong. And the John Kerrys of this world and all these kind of people in the United Nations are still using this fake data. And of course, the ideologues, if you will, are in the main, you correct me if you think I'm wrong on this one, are largely Malthusian. They actually want to see massive cuts in the global population, which is why, of course, I would not take any. I wouldn't take any of their vaccines, but it's not a very good model, is it? When somebody wants to actually reduce the population, here's the medicine. No, thank you. No, I won't. And that's, of course, that's all coming out now as well, of course. But I don't know. I'm old enough to remember the Ice Age thing, we're frightened of the Ice Age. And it's also more understandable. If we were going into a new Ice Age, that really is a threat. If we were, that is a threat. Colder is more dangerous. Warmer is not, historically. Warmer's better. But leaving that aside, of course. Now, here's an interesting point. Interested in your view on this. The man on the Clapham omnibus. I go to a boozer down the road, and it's an artisan boozer. So you get your chippies, your sparkies, your cabbies, it's full of people of that ilk, as it were, which is probably why I get on with them so well, because they're practical men who like a sherbet. So I always enjoy their company. They're not buying into this at all. They're not buying into the climate scare. They're just not, because they're practical men. A lot of them work outside or in the building trade, or they're actually doing what I call a real job. I've never had a real job in my life, of course, but in the financial world, it is real. I can't even put a shelf up. But these guys are practical men who work with their hands a lot, and they're not buying it. My experience, although around the middle-class dinner party table, which these days I'm not invited to very often, I have to say, there seems to me to be no limit to the stupidity of the English middle class when it comes to matters of this nature. I have a good friend of mine, he's a judge. You're trained in actually looking at data, looking at facts and making a deduction as a judge. He doesn't do that. He's a climate fanatic. He's not just mildly greeny. He's absolutely barking mad. But it seems to me to be an English middle class thing. And of course, they have the levers of power, do they not? They run it. They run the BBC. They run the civil service. And of course, it's Jobsworths. And all this kind of thing creates jobs, and they create empires, and they're all paid extremely well, and they all have index-linked pensions that go with it, so on and so forth. It is not in their interest, these people, to actually change their minds, is it? It's not in their interest, because they're doing very nicely. Thank you very much. How do we think we could push back at this, and how long do you think it will take before it's so blindingly obviously not so that even they can look out of the window? But then if you I've mentioned this before on my channel. If you want to know just how stupid the English middle class are, go to Tate Modern and overhear their conversations when they're shown a dog turd on a blanket and they interpret it as art. There is almost nothing you cannot persuade the English middle class to do.
Emperor's New Clothes. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. So on the modelling, I've challenged. Well, it was a pretty mild challenge, but part of the work I was doing on air pollution with Together after the ULEZ and Sadiq Khan's nonsense. I did. We wrote to Imperial, just sort of stating a few objections and asking, you know, for some clarity. And the letter was barely even, you know, two words. The first one beginning with F, and the second one beginning with O. Right? They weren't interested in an exchange about why we believed that they were wrong. In fact, to be precise about it, we agreed. But the fact is, the science that had been produced about air pollution was being ignored by the very scientists that produced that scientific investigation, right? So they would. This is what I'm talking about, right? The scientific committee that the government assembled found no relationship that was reliable between air pollution and mortality risk, right? And stated that it should not be expressed. The risk of air pollution exposure should not be expressed in terms of mortality. But that is what Sadiq Khan did. That is what the institution did, and that's what some of those scientists went on to do. So they broke their own rules. So essentially, the science, the modeling, the models doesn't really matter. All that counts is an institution with authority says whatever it wants to say, and that's what gets reproduced throughout this strata of society. You've mentioned these, you know, this upper middle class conceit, these dangerous ideas that they won't allow to be challenged. They won't allow them to be challenged in a dinner party. They won't allow them to be challenged in the media, and they won't entertain debate, even at the level of the academy and the you know, on campus. They won't even engage in an email discussion about why they might be wrong. And that's amazing, because these are supposed to be, you know, science is supposed to be, you know, the Royal Society, which I've already mentioned, its Latin motto is nullis in verba, which is supposed to mean on the word of no one, i.e. not from authority. You know, truth doesn't come from authority. It comes from the scientific process, the scientific method. So you'd think that academics would be the first people to say, "Oh, someone's challenged my work. I may, you know, this may lead to some insight. This may lead to a path of investigation which takes humanity forward." I'm being wildly optimistic about academia and Britain's professional classes here. So that's not what happens. They tell you to go. They're offended, and they think very little of you if you suggest that they might be wrong. Yesterday, Justin Rowlett of the BBC's climate editor, claimed that reforms, challenges to the net zero agenda are wrong because renewables are getting cheaper. So this is a multi-billion-pound global news agency whose climate editor isn't capable of, for himself, going to the source of the data, which is very public, very easy to download. It's the low carbon contracts company, which is the sort of the vehicle that is statutorily responsible for collating all this data and making it publicly available. So that he wasn't able to go and download the last 8 years of it's called the intermittent market reference price. This is the cost of energy, electricity on the UK wholesale market before wind turbines have had their slice. And then he could have downloaded the data of all of the expected prices, the strike prices, the contracts for different strike prices that each renewable generator is paid per megawatt hour. Right. And if he'd have got those two very easily obtainable sources of data, he would see that it's not possible for wind farms, onshore or offshore, to produce power at a lower cost than power from gas, right? But he didn't do that. He just reproduces government statistics. So this is the problem we're up against. This is seemingly an expert journalist who has got no interest in investigating, for instance, got no curiosity about how the claims he is reproducing are produced in the first instance. He's not interested in who they serve, and who made them and why, and so on and so forth. So I think, I mean, I don't think there's an easy solution to this. And obviously part of the solution is hoping that challenger parties such as Reform, and the others make some headway at this in the next election, hopefully before it's too late, because Labour is going to roll this stuff out as fast as it can before democracy is allowed to get its foot in the door. But I think a lot of this has got to be extra political, if you like, as in outside politics. We've got to, it's things like, it's projects like yours, your YouTube channel, that's going to take this message out there. But it's not enough for people to just watch Godfrey Bloom's YouTube channel. You have to take it, you have to share it, right? You have to put it in front of people, and then you have to act on it. You have to organize. You have to assemble people in your town and village, and you have to say, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to launch a challenge? How are we going to put candidates up for local elections so we can resist things like LTNs, and we're going to have to use the tools that the censorship state, if you like, has provided against them. We have to complain to the BBC when people like Justin Rowlatt produce this kind of nonsense. We have to take the, use their weapons against them, and we have to be engaged. We can't take freedom for granted. We can't take liberty for granted. So we have to act on all of these things rather than expecting the political parties we want with the ideas we want to be there on a plate, and we have to dismantle this ideology and other ideologies. So if I'm not going over too long, I could talk a little bit about the power of ideology and green, and why people became so entrenched in green ideology. Or
by all means, tell us.
So my comparison. A bit people. I mean, again, it's ideology is a nebulous thing, and it's the hardest thing to believe that your apprehension of the world is a fiction, right? It's very difficult to tell people that what they believe, because whether they've seen it on the BBC, whether it's drip fed into them, and it's become the story through which they understand their day-to-day interactions with the world. And so anything that falls apart to someone who's of a very green mind, so if the economy is failing, someone who's of a green persuasion will see this as a result of climate change, right? And this has to be understood. People assemble their view of the world through fictions one way or another, and challenging that is extremely difficult. So but what's happened, I think, to make our case a lot easier, in fact, if we want to start dismantling this, over the last 10 years, I would suggest, maybe 20, ideologies of various different kinds have asserted ever more purchase on a smaller and smaller number of people, but to ever more radical effect. And this is most visible, I think, in the gender ideology debates, the debates about gender ideology, whether you can be born in the wrong body, as it were, and also the racial grievance ideologies, the ones who did these kind of attempts to pull back, to go and find a fence hundreds of years ago, and to bring that back into the present. Largely, these are imports from America. But maybe that's beside the point. In the gender ideology, suddenly out of nowhere, although I remember it sort of, when we met, I was at York University. I was a mature student, and it was beginning. This social justice stuff was just beginning to seep into a place like York, which is a little bit of a more conservative university than many. But you were beginning to seep in, and it was quite alien to me. It was quite a surprise for me to see some of this stuff. But of course, it's snowballed since then, and it's become ubiquitous, or at least the sort of the expressions of it have become ubiquitous. And now people think that it's right for, or have thought that it's right for children who may or may not be experiencing dysphoria with their gender to be intervened with medically. Now that's such a travesty to most people, and so I think this is but I think it is a perfect demonstration of how a political ideology can inform people's understandings of things to and thereby create move institutions, public institutions in which we should have faith and confidence, into taking extremely reckless measures, whether that's a school or whether that's a clinical context. So this, schools were famously asked to conceal from parents their children's preferred gender roles and so on. And of course, that campaign was it encouraged doctors to treat gender dysphoria as a medical condition that needed to have surgery and injections, either to delay puberty or to alter the body. These are, just such extraordinarily radical interventions. So, but the story is ideological, and rather than admit that the story that these children's experiences were transmitted to them by ideology through ideologues promoting this kind of agenda, they said, oh, no, it's definitely a pathology. There's definitely a causal, like a cancer or an infection. There is a way that this can be understood as a disorder, as a disease, right, that needs treatment. But they should have said, no, we think this is ideological. We think this is a very complicated issue about ideas that are in society that children are exposed to take them down this path. So I would say when this should alert us to the power of ideology, to how capable it is of distorting people's view of the world and their moral conscience. So that
can I just
yeah.
I don't know whether you caught David Starkey's lecture quite recently. I think it was. No. It's very good. If I haven't seen it, it's worth googling it up. It's easy. It's quite easy to find. And he was really making the case that the Blair era virtually dismantled our institutions. Everything from the principles of law to politics to sovereignty of parliament and all that kind of thing, which I've done before. I don't want to go down that particular rabbit hole now. But one of the points he made very strongly, as David Starkey always does, is that nobody really nowadays is accountable. Nobody is accountable. So no one person is actually in charge of anything. It's all an amorphous kind of mass. I'll give you an example of that, an easy local one. Somebody wanted to build an old people's home next door to me, or nearly next door to me, with something like sort of 25 units. And it's a small village, as you know, because you visited me. And it's not on main drainage. And so all these people crowded in one, just sort of like a hotel, you might argue, a permanently full hotel. And I tried to find out where the waste was going to go. How was it going to go? And now, in just a house, it drains away, it seeps away, and that's what it's done for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's fine, that works. But I couldn't find anybody who was responsible. I spoke to the drainage board. I spoke to environmental officers at the council. I spoke to building regulators, and I was in office. So I was inquiring as a member of the European Parliament, that rather absurd organisation, but I was a member of it anyway. Nobody was responsible. Nobody could tell me where the waste was going to go from something like 60 or 70 people living in a few square feet in very badly drained anyway. Nobody could take responsibility, and they all said it was somebody else's responsibility. And they all ended up with the building regulators. It's everybody says it's building regulators. Well, if you were an environmental officer at the local council, surely if that isn't your job, what the hell is your job? Where's the shit going to go? And so consequently, nobody's responsible. So it seems that the National Health Service or the trustees, the trusts that make up the National, nobody there is responsible for anything. So Big Pharma, for example, says it will be this way. And my experience latterly of most physicians, most general practitioners, that they're noddy dogs. They and another a graduate friend of mine said the thing is that he knew about medical students. He said that one thing medical students will have is a photographic memory. So what they can do is every year they pass the next year's exams because they can memorize stuff. And the stuff they memorize is largely set and sponsored by Big Pharma. So which is why when you go to your doctor, the answer is always a pill. There's nothing else. Never diet, never lifestyle. No, it's a pill. And he's only got 10 minutes to see. So consequently, all the people who are in positions of power of any sort, no matter how small or no matter how great, aren't really accountable. And of course, everybody should be, parliamentarians should be accountable to their electorates. Well, we've certainly seen in the last 10 years, there's nothing of the sort. Representative democracy represents nobody. They're not interested. They only fill the House of Commons when they are debating their salaries. That's the only time it's ever full. It's empty. And we've seen Andrew Bridgen making his points, very valid data points and statistics, to an empty house. So nobody's responsible. So nobody pushes back against these ideologues. No matter how absurd, it seems we've got almost ad absurdum, doesn't it? I mean, when you see John Kerry flying in a private jet, we see Emma Thompson, the great celebrity, flying first-class British Airways to make a speech at a greeny thingy thing and then flying all the way back with no sense of irony. It seems that ideologues have no sense of, one might say, irony or shame. They seem to have no sense of shame, which normal people would have, wouldn't they?
Yeah, you'd think so. We'd hope so. I guess what you're talking about is sort of, I think of it as agencies without authority and authorities without agency. And so you get this sort of merry-go-round. You don't know until you've done something wrong in these over-bureaucratized fields of economic activity. And when you've done something wrong, of course, you'll find out who was responsible for it, right? They'll come and punish you. But the broader question about the ideologues and I mean, we kind of maybe it was the same way we've put so much faith in institutions, celebrities. Emma Thompson, Emma Thompson flies across the Atlantic to go to an Extinction Rebellion protest, not just with no sense of irony, but people have pointed out, I think a number of people have pointed out, that the hypocrisy is the point. It's you little people who aren't allowed to fly or have a gas boiler in your home. Emma Thompson will be allowed to fly. It doesn't matter. Will and Kate will be allowed to, and of course Harry and Meghan. They'll be able to fly, but it's everyone else who's expected to. It's do as you're told, not do as I do, and that sort of sets that kind of hierarchy up, and then of course, in sort of in a corollary in a way of that, these kind of weirdo degenerate ideologies can fester throughout that process, because who are you? If you're expected to be the one that cuts your carbon emissions, you're not really going to be allowed to be the one who challenges the ideology of forcing people to reduce carbon emissions. You're the little people. You don't get a say, and whereas that. I mean, maybe I don't want to romanticize the past. I don't want to look at it with rose-tinted glasses. But there was a situation in the UK, in Britain, where through the democratic process, the people you've talked about, the people who work for a living, the people who experience nature as it is, not as it is on a spreadsheet or a computer model, and the people who go and move stuff from A to B, and the people who construct stuff, they had a stake in things, and they had a say, and they were able to say, this political, they were able to move their vote. They do, you know, it is often ideologues who take constituencies for granted, but it was very often working class people who moved their vote from Labour, which used to seemingly represent the working class, to Conservative, because they felt their interests were better served by the party, either because that party was more competent than the other one, or that party had a better recipe for how society should be managed, if it should be managed at all, which is always the presupposition of today's political class. They always believe that everything should be managed and everything should be headed towards some utopian goal. Most people don't share that view. So there was always some level of grounding. But now, as you point out, there's this weird cast of people with these bizarre ideas, with no sense of shame, and no sense of irony, and they call the show. We got Gary Lineker telling us how we must live. We get Emma Thompson telling us how we live. No one says, well, where's his scientific credentials? I'm always challenged for where my scientific credentials are, but those people aren't asking where Al Gore's credentials, or John Kerry's, or Greta's, for that matter, credentials are. It's always, you know, there's the credentialism. This sort of the state we're in now seems to have been built around this idea of authorities as people who are going to tell you how you're going to live, but there's no agency in it. It's like kind of the blob. I think it's a great term, the blob. It captures the situation so well. It's like a nebulous organism. It doesn't have a core, doesn't have a central, doesn't have a brain. It just blobs along.
I always think one of my favorite clips was Harrison Ford, another celebrity, telling people to trust the science as he read his teleprompter. You know, these people had, but that's why I rather like the artisan class, if you will. That, you know, that's where I like to drink, because you don't get any of that. I call them the sergeant's mess. As you know, I was had a very undistinguished army career, I have to say, and I wasn't good enough to get into the sergeant's mess, so I had to become an officer. But you get that's good, horny-handed comment. My mother was a senior NCO in the WAF in the war, so I hope I get a bit of that from her. But it's absolutely, it's a fascinating subject, of course, and we could go on forever and ever. But where can my people find you? Where can we find you? Have you got a strapline or something we can put on the clip here? Put underneath.
I'm on Twitter if you like that sort of thing. It's bit street fightery. Twitter, it's rough and ready. I'm Climate Resistance, CLIM number 8 Resistance. I'm on Substack because we've got a little organization set up trying to campaign to get the debate put back at the center of politics, debate about climate change, which is so the website for the campaign is climatedebate.co.uk. Or also we've got on the Substack I think it's netzeroscandal.substack.com. And
I follow some of those, yeah.
And of course, I write for the Daily Skeptic a couple of articles.
Yes,
as well. If you
okay, we'll put the look for the leads, everyone watching this. If you like more of Ben's enormous brain, you can press the buttons and get him. I certainly follow him whenever I can, and I don't think I mentioned at the beginning. He was, when I was on the environmental committee at the European Union, he was my source. He was my immediately go-to sort of sort out the nonsense I had to listen to in those committees. And boy, next to the Fem committee, next to the Women's committee, I heard more shit on that committee than anything else. But anyway, thank you again, Ben, for coming on and giving me your time. Most grateful. As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I'll automatically share it with you. So surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.